Well, a few years ago, there was a group of seminary students in the U.S. who were in the process of writing their dissertation, and they were writing it on how children that have grown up in evangelical Christian homes develop a mental concept or a mental picture of who God is. So one of the things that they did was they got together and they decided that they wanted to find out what they thought of God. So they had each of the children, a group of children that they had assembled, write a short letter to him. And they told the children that they could write this letter to God about absolutely anything that they wanted. So these are actually a few of the letters that they wrote. So Larry said, "Dear God, maybe Cain and Abel would not kill each other so much if they had their own rooms. It works with my brother." The second one said, "Dear God," this is from Nan, "I bet it's very hard for you to love all of everybody in the whole world. There are only 4 people in our family, and I can never do it." Mark said this, "Dear God, I read your book and I like it. Did you ever write any others? I would like to write a book someday with the same kinds of stories. Where do you get your ideas? Best wishes, Mark." Johnny said this, "Dear God, how come you didn't invent any new animals lately? We still have just all the old ones." Peter said this, "Please send Dennis Clark to a different camp this year." And Donna said this, "We read, I am assuming that's in school, that Thomas Edison made the light. But in Sunday school, they said you did it. So I bet he stole your idea." Finally, Norma said, "Dear God, did you mean for the giraffe to look like that, or was it an accident?" So, very cute, aren't they? These letters reminded me of a quote by a woman by the name of Barbara Brown Taylor, who's an author and a professor in the U.S. And she said, "When human beings try to describe God, we're actually like a bunch of oysters trying to describe a ballerina. We simply do not have the equipment necessary to understand something so utterly beyond us, but that has never stopped us from trying." Isn't that interesting? A number of years ago, J.B. Phillips wrote this wonderful little book that was called Your God is Too Small. Has anybody ever read that book? Yeah, a wonderful, wonderful little book. And it's this fascinating book that looks at the many mental images that people carry around with them of who God is. And those images include, these are some of what he talks about in his book. God is the resident policeman. God is what he called the parental hangover, or that is, we tend to imagine God like he's our parents. God is the big grand old man or the big guy in the sky. Or God as in this form of a meek and mild Jesus. And one of the things that he concluded in the book was that all of these images that we have of God, that we've painted of him, were actually destructive because none of them are complete. And none of them even come close to being accurate to defining who God really is. And if you think about it, and I think this is true for us too, that none of the mental pictures that you and I have of who Yahweh is will ever be adequate to fully encompass him. Yet it's within our human nature to try and put God in some kind of understandable, measurable box. Do you think that's true? Now, I don't want to throw a deep thought at you so soon into a message, but I really want you to chew on this for a moment. I want you to think about this, and I want you to wrestle for a few minutes with this question. What is your mental picture of God? If someone were to ask you to describe him, how would you even go about doing that? If someone were to ask you to tell them about his attributes, what would you tell those people? Let me put it another way. In an effort to help people understand who God is, what would you compare him to? Would you talk about him as being your heavenly Father? Would you talk about him as being the sacrificial lamb? Would you talk to him about being an all-powerful dictator? How would you explain him in a way that a person you're telling could fully grasp who this God was? I mean, these are some great questions, and likely your answers to that question would point to a number of things. It would point to what you have been taught about God, would point to your own reading and studying that you've done and what that's revealed to you about him. Not to mention, it would probably point to your own personal experiences that you've had with him. What can be a challenge to answering that question as well, and I'm sure you'd agree, for those of us who are committed followers of Christ, is that our picture of who God is always changing, and it's always supposed to be changing, right? Because we know that one of God's greatest desires is that we, his followers, that we'd come to know him and that you would have this intimate relationship with him. And if that in fact is true, then our relationship with God should always be growing, and our understanding and knowledge of him should always be growing. And as long as we keep getting to know him better, he continues to reveal new parts of who he is to us, right? So if our picture of God keeps changing, how do we even begin to describe him? Well, in a sense, that is what we want to look at this morning as we continue to work our way through the 10 Commandments. 2 weeks ago, we started this series through the 10 Commandments that we're calling Game of Stones, and we started out by giving this overview of how the nation of Israel received the 10 Commandments. And we talked about this as being part of the old covenant with Israel. We talked about how when they were given these 10 Commandments, they were literally 2 months out of slavery in Egypt. And that's all that they had ever known. Every single one of the Israelites, all they had ever known their entire life was slavery. When God gave them these 10 Commandments, just 2 months out from that. This morning we're going to continue our conversation, and we're going to look at the second commandment, and what we're going to see is that the first and the second commandment are really closely tied together. In fact, what we're going to discover is that there's a very important relationship that exists between the two. And they're found in Exodus 20, verses 1 to 5. Let me read them. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So he's reminding them that they are there because of what he has done. And then he gives them the first commandment, which is, you shall have no other gods before me. Then he gives them the second commandment, which is this: you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So with the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, is really all about who we worship. This second commandment, make no idols, has everything to do with how we worship. Where the first commandment requires that we worship only the one true God as he's revealed in Scripture, the second commandment says don't make idols or images for your worship. And that includes both worshiping the image of a false god and making any kind of an image that represents the one true God as well. So the second commandment is specifically prohibiting two things: worshiping false gods and making an image of the one true God, particularly for the purpose of worship. Now, the first part of that we likely understand, right? And it's the part that's closely connected to what the first commandment talks about. You shall have no other God except the one true God as revealed in Scripture. But the second part might be a little bit more of a stretch for us, because it prohibits God's people from really trying to capture him with any kind of a graphic image. If you remember from last week, one of the implications of the nation of Israel following the first commandment was that it made them unique among all the other nations of the world at that time. Because none of the other nations, none of the other people groups, none of the other surrounding nations worshipped only one God. They all had multiple gods, which made them, remember the word? Polytheistic, right? Where the nation of Israel worshipped only one God, which is called monotheistic. So if the first commandment set Israel apart from their neighbors, then the second commandment made them seem even more strange to the other surrounding neighbors. Because all the surrounding nations had images and idols to represent their many, many gods. Remember again that when the nation of Israel received the 10 Commandments, they were 2 months out of Egypt. In fact, when you walked into the temple of an Egyptian god, as they would all be very familiar with, when they walked in there, you would see an idol. You would see the representative of one of 114 gods that the Egyptian religion worshipped. The god of something standing in front of an altar. And that physical idol was the only way that the Egyptian people knew what God they were in fact worshiping. It's interesting to think about this discussion in light of New Testament times, because scholars believe that at the time of the Apostle Paul, ancient Greeks worshipped upwards of 30,000 gods. I mean, their homes and their cities had monuments to them everywhere because they didn't want any of the other gods to be offended. We know that they even erected one monument to what they called the unknown god to make sure that if they had missed any, that he or she would not become angry with them. And remember, polytheists believe that humanity was created for the sole purpose of trying to figure out how to make these gods happy. Compare that to what happened when the people of Israel walked into the tabernacle, or later on to the temple of Israel. There was no God up front. There was no idol. There was no image. And that was absurd according to all of the other nations that were watching them. So the logical question you might be asking from this is, so what's the big deal? What's the harm? Why is it that God told them that they should not make any image of him? After all, some of us say a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So couldn't it add to our worship of God? Why is it that God cares enough about this to tell his chosen people not to do it? Well, to answer that question, we're going to look at the story of something that happened to Israel in the next book of the Bible, the book of Numbers. And it's a story that illustrates what happens when followers of the one true God try and limit him and try and contain him into an image or an idol. What I really hope that we're going to grasp is something important about human nature and about the danger of trying to define God within an object. So we're going to work our way through the story, but as we do it, keep this in mind. When we pick up this story in Numbers chapter 21, the nation of Israel is now wandering in the wilderness. And they've been told that because they didn't trust in what God had told them that he was going to do, and rather he was leading them to the promised land, and because of fear they said, I don't think so. I don't think we can do it. I don't think we can defeat those people. God punished them by making them wander in the wilderness for 40 years or a generation before receiving what God had truly promised them, and that was the promised land. Despite that judgment, though, God has still been with them. He's still continued to provide for them, and he's still continued to protect them. It's also important to note, before we get into this story, that 3 very significant things have just happened to the nation of Israel. Firstly, Aaron, we talked about him last week. Aaron, Moses' right-hand man, has just died. They have just won a huge victory over the Canaanites. And the king of Edom has just refused to give them permission to pass through their land. Now, there were implications to that. That meant that they needed to take this long trek around Edom in order to get to the promised land. It meant that they were heading southeast when they really wanted to be going northwest. And that meant that they were wandering in a desert, wearing the same clothes day after day, wearing the same shoes day after day, eating the same food day after day, walking over the same terrain day after day. And all of that meant that they were quite grumpy about their circumstances. This detour meant that Moses had to take the people on sort of a circular route around Edom. And this change made their journey tedious. It made it uncomfortable because the terrain was incredibly difficult. It was a lot of up and down. It was a lot of pulling their wagons. It was a lot of pulling their wagons over rocky roads. It was a lot of steep valleys. I mean, you name it, they had to go through it. Just on a bit of a side note here, if you happen to be doing a summer road trip with your kids this summer and asking, how are we going to keep these kids entertained for hours in the car, you might want to read that story and find out that you don't have it too bad. But this rocky terrain probably had a big part in why the people were whining and complaining so much. More specifically, and this is important that we note, is that they were complaining against God, and they were complaining against God's chosen representative, that being Moses. So with all that said, Numbers 21, starting at verse 4, says this. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom, but the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in this wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water, and we detest this miserable food," which was manna. And you might be hearing this and thinking to yourself, here we go again, because this seems to be the reoccurring complaint from the people of Israel. Life was better in Egypt. Why did you bring us out here in this desert to die? They had said those same exact words before, and sadly, they would do it again and again in the future. It is so interesting, isn't it, to read it, because they're so quick to forget what they had come from. They were so quick to forget what God had done to secure their freedom. They were quick to forget that they were the people that God had hand-chosen to be his own. And they were quick to keep going back to their old familiar ways of complaining. They said, "We have no bread, we have no water, we hate this miserable manna." And those were the words that were coming out of their mouth, but what they were actually saying to God was, your gifts are really no gifts at all. Your grace is really no grace. You really don't care about us. You really haven't provided us with any blessings, but this is a curse. You've subjected us to this curse of wandering in this wilderness. They were so quick to forget. And when you really think about it, it's incredibly ungrateful, incredibly unappreciative for them to be saying that. I mean, how could they be so ungrateful? And how could they have forgotten of all of the miracles that had gotten them to where they were today? I think the real miracle in this story is that it's a miracle that God didn't strike them down in that exact moment. I mean, invariably, when things aren't going the way they thought that they deserved, the people directed their complaints towards their leader and towards God. And Moses gets these complaints head on, and there's no holding back from the people. We're told then that God got angry with them for their complaining. And in verse 6, it says, "Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them, and they bit the people, and many Israelites died." So their complaining brings this judgment from God, and he sends these snakes. It's interesting. Today there are actually 7 different types of venomous snakes found in that area, including vipers and cobras. So he sends these natural, everyday, regular animals that you'd expect to see in the desert to their camp. But they arrive in these unnatural numbers, and we're told that the lives of the people in the camp in the nation of Israel are threatened. It's also interesting to note that in Jewish and Christian culture, snakes are almost always symbols of evil, aren't they? I mean, in the Garden of Eden, it was the snake that tempted Eve. The devil is called the serpent in the book of Revelation. And in this passage, those snakes are used as tools of God's judgment. So the recipients of this judgment go to Moses, and they say, we're told in verse 7, the people came to Moses and said, "We've sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. Kind of reminds you of the prodigal son a little bit, doesn't it? Just like the prodigal son in Luke 15, the people of Israel come to their senses and they ask for forgiveness. They come to Moses, and it's interesting. Note what they say to him. They say, "We have sinned. We have sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you." They didn't make excuses. They didn't try and justify what they had done. They admitted their sin, and that it was first and foremost against the Lord their God. Moses prays, and his prayer is answered in a most unusual way. Because look what the Lord instructs Moses to do in verse 8. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." I find that a little strange. Do you find that a little strange? I mean, can you imagine Moses' reaction to this when God told him to do it? He might even have been thinking about this second commandment. Maybe he even said to God, "But Lord, you've told us not to make any graven images." I mean, never mind Moses. Can you imagine the reaction of the people to this? Because understand that it would have taken time to have made this bronze snake, right? And while it was being made, people were still getting bitten. People were still dying. Parents were still trying to protect their children from these snakes. I mean, why not just remove the snakes from camp and heal those who were sick and dying? Why not send them some magic serum? In fact, the people prayed, "Take these snakes away from us." And God chose not to answer what they were really asking by taking those snakes away. It's interesting that the consequences were allowed to remain with the Israelites. Day after day, they were still getting bitten. You know, they still felt that fiery poison coursing through their veins when they would get bitten. But what did God do? God did provide a kind of salvation from death. He allowed the Israelites who trusted God to avoid dying as a result of their sin. Moses did what God had told him to do. And God took this symbol that is connected with, often with evil and sin, all the way from Genesis 3 to Revelation 20. And he made Moses make this bronze statue. Again, no sophisticated snake serum, no removal of the snakes, no miraculous immediate healing. He didn't create some special liturgy or ceremony that the priests could use to save themselves from the snake bites. He just said, "Look at the bronze snake on the wooden pole, and you will be saved." Verse 9. Moses finishes making the bronze snake, and we're told, "So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. And when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived." So the snake's made, and the snake on the pole is lifted up, and God is faithful to his word. And when anyone who has been bitten turns and looks up at the snake, they're healed. But there's an interesting side note to this story that we're really never told that the snakes were taken away, are we? In fact, there's a reason to believe from the Jewish oral tradition that is still passed down that those snakes actually stayed with the nation of Israel all throughout their years of wandering in the wilderness. Those snakes still followed them. So think about that with me for a minute. You could be bitten one day, go to the bronze snake, look up, and be healed. And then the next day have exactly the same thing happen. Again and again. And every time that were to happen, you would be reminded again and again and again of the lesson that God did not want you to forget. I mean, God could have removed the snakes, but the people would likely have not learned the lesson about the consequences of their sin. The bronze snake likely remained in the camp as a symbol of God's gracious dealing once more with his wayward people. Okay, you may be sitting there saying to yourself, "Nice story, Bruce. Nice story of God dealing with the nation of Israel, but how does this possibly relate to the second commandment? How does this possibly relate to not making for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below? How does it relate to not bowing down or worshiping idols?" Well, the fascinating thing about this story is the next time we hear anything at all about this brass serpent is actually in the 18th chapter of 2 Kings. And what we find there is that it's been over 600 years since the incident that we just talked about. It's been 600 years since the snakes in the desert. It's been over 600 years since Moses made the serpent until this period that we're talking about now in Israel's history. And can you guess what has happened in that time? That bronze snake on the wooden pole, that symbol of God's forgiveness, that symbol of his healing and of his grace and his mercy, that symbol of his salvation to the nation of Israel. Well, it's now become a symbol that God's chosen people have chosen to worship. It's now become their idol. And they're now burning incense to it. Apparently, over the centuries, the people began to look at that snake as something more than simply a reminder of God's power. They began to see it as actually a symbol or an idol of God himself. We read in 2 Kings 18, and I'll read verses 1 to 4. In the 3rd year of Hosea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king and reigned in Jerusalem for 29 years. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, cut down the ashered poles, and then catch this. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made. For up to that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. The worship of this snake and on the pole had gotten so bad that King Hezekiah smashed the thing into pieces. And what had started out as a reminder of God had actually become a god to the people. You know, the point that I'm trying to make here is simply this. There is just something about human nature that gravitates towards the worship of objects. And Israel learned that even religious things can become substitutes for God. You know, whether it's a wooden pole with a bronze snake on it, a statue, a picture, maybe a cross. Those things can never be used as a replacement to God. I wonder even about the symbol of the cross. I mean, we wear it around our necks. We have bracelets and T-shirts and earrings with the cross on it. And I'm not suggesting to you that those are bad things. But I wonder, did these symbols that we wear really represent the pain, the sweat, the agony, the blood that was shed for you and me on the cross? I would suggest most often not. It's almost commonplace nowadays to see musicians and actors wearing a cross. And you have to wonder, what does that really mean to them? The cross was this horrible and brutal way to kill somebody. And as long as we utilize the cross and other symbols as representations or reminders of our faith, that's acceptable. But when they become the focus of our faith, we've moved in the wrong direction. The point that the second commandment is trying to make is simply this, and if you remember nothing else this morning, remember this. No matter how good or how powerful or how beautiful or how spiritually significant the image or the object might be, it can never contain all that God is. All man-made images of God are inadequate because God is much greater, more powerful, more full of love, more gracious, more merciful, and more holy than you or I could ever imagine. No matter how long you've been a Christian, no matter how well you know your Bible, no matter how deep your relationship with God may be, you have only scratched the surface of knowing Him. I think one of the things that God is trying to say to the nation of Israel in this story is I think what He's wanting to do is take them right back to the foot of Mount Sinai when they first heard these 10 commandments audibly from His voice. He wants them to hear this. I had you assemble before me in front of Mount Sinai. You saw that I had no form, but you saw my awesome glory. You saw the awesome fire that blazed as I descended onto the mountain. You heard the screaming thunder, and it gripped you with fear to the point where you backed off. And from the very heavens and the deep darkness of the clouds, you heard my voice. You cannot contain that in an idol. You cannot capture that in an image. And in some ways, you can't even describe me, and any attempt to try will ultimately only minimize how great and how awesome I really am. I think he's saying to Israel, let me put this another way. Let me simplify it for you. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. He says, don't create an idol to represent me, because a picture or an object will only limit who I really am. I love the way one author puts it that I read this week. He wrote, when we do that, we end up domesticating God. We make him into something that we can handle viewing, something we can handle speaking with, and hope that we can even control. As I was preparing this week, I found my thoughts shifting to the fact that I think we all have a tendency to do this. We all have a tendency to create God in our own image, don't we? Maybe in our sincere attempt to know him and understand him, I wonder if we don't box him and if we don't try and contain him. We create these visual or maybe even these mental images of who he is. And I wonder if those images don't become our idols. The fear is that once we start doing that, we start viewing the things that he wants us to do as just another option among many. When we start to create God in our image, we start to replace his plan with our plan. We start to interchange what he teaches with what the world teaches. We start to replace what he has said with what other people have said. When we start to create God in our image, his truth quickly becomes replaced by the things that make our message more socially acceptable. And when we create an image of God, whether physical or simply a mental idol of who he is, we limit our ability, I believe, to truly, fully worship the one true God. And that is what God was saying to the nation of Israel. Embrace this. God is a God who will never be completely understood. God is a God whose awesomeness and glory should provoke a healthy fear within each of us so that we can begin to worship him, the one true God, and not some image of a God that we've created, not some false God of our own making. The one true God. That is how he wants us to worship him. So if the first commandment tells us who is to be worshipped, then the second tells us how he wants to be worshipped. I'm going to close with this. This is a quote from Oswald Chambers. And he says, the moment God is figured out with nice, neat lines and definitions, we're no longer dealing with God. Instead, we're dealing with our own creation of who he is. And may God give each and every one of us the ability to love him and to be in awe of him and to worship him in spirit and in truth. Let's pray.